So thanks very much for letting me speak today. Yeah, hopefully it's an interesting bit of research, and if nothing else, hopefully it kind of gives you an overview of what is possible with the 360 Giving data set and some of the tools that are available related, which are kind of related to this research as well. So if I start with a bit about 360 Giving, so we are a registered charity, and we are have kind of given ourselves the task of helping funders publish open data about the grants that they make, and then to help others use that data to make charitable giving better and kind of more effective. So we work with funders kind of quite intensively to help them publish their data. It's a voluntary scheme. We have created a what's called a data standard, so a set of rules about what should happen when you're publishing your data and what format it should be in and what fields you should include and things. As well as helping funders publish data, we help people to use it. So we do that through things like we run training sessions, we create tools. You might have seen a tool called GrantNav, which is a kind of search engine for all the data that's been published. And there's a tool called 360 Insights as well, which I'll give a kind of demo of a bit later on. And we also try to encourage the data to be used in research. So this kind of report I'm talking about today is an example of the kind of thing that we're trying to um, show that the data can be kind of useful. Yeah, so we've got about 150 funders publishing. Publishing is voluntary, but there's a kind of growing swell of funders that are realizing that it's a useful thing to do, and that it's a kind of valuable thing to do. We recently had a big tranche of data from the government, publishing data about who they funded in 2018-19, I think. So it's a little bit behind the times, but it's great that it's not just kind of private foundations that are seeing the value in publishing this data. It's also government. Some local authorities are publishing, community foundations. We've had a really good kind of response, and particularly over the last kind of 6 to 8 months, with everything that's been going on, we've seen kind of funders seeing the value in this data in helping them do things like plan their COVID response funding, and check where they're overlapping with other funders, for example. So in terms of this session, so I'll give a quick introduction to the research. We've then got a fun play your cards right style quiz where I'll be playing the role of Bruce Forsyth. And then I'll go into a bit more detail on some of the things we found in the research, and then we'll end it up with a kind of demo of our 360 Insights tool. Live tech demos are always fraught with difficulties, but hopefully I'll be able to show you some of the things you can do with that tool. We might have time for a quick demo of GrantNav as well. That's one of the kind of more most accessible ways of accessing the data. So this research, so it was funded by a local trust, and it was done jointly with 360 Giving and with NCVO, the NCVO research team. We published it in August this year, but mostly the data work was kind of done pre-COVID, so there's not a lot of kind of COVID-specific data in there, or none rather. It was an update of a bit of research. So I used to work at NCVO. It was a bit of research I did at NCVO about 5 years ago. The 360 Giving dataset was very much kind of in its infancy then. I think there were only about 15 or 20 funders. There's now 150, so it covers a lot more ground, and the data is a lot sort of better quality than it was 5 years ago as well. So it was an opportunity to kind of revisit that research and hopefully kind of improve, show how the underlying data had improved and get some better results out of it as well. So starting with some of our terms, what do we mean by below the radar? So what we're really talking about here is organizations that don't really appear in other data sets. So when you're looking at kind of bigger data about the sector, you're usually looking at sources like the Charity Commission, Register of Charities, Companies House have some data on charities and other organisations. And what we're talking about here is organisations that don't appear on those lists of organisations, and you can't find out much about them. So that usually means they're not registered. It usually means they're small in terms of income, not necessarily in terms of impact or their kind of footprint in the community. And by their kind of by definition, there's not a lot of data about them. So we wanted to see, does the 360 Giving dataset provide an opportunity to find out a bit more about those organisations? I should say below the radar is not the kind of best term for them in that's possible. I think there's other ways of describing them. We went with below the radar just because it sort of has a sort of accepted meaning, but fully conscious that it's not necessarily the best way of kind of describing these organisations. Other researchers talked about grassroots organisations or community groups or micro organisations. There was a report from about 20 years ago that called them micro social enterprises. But yeah, hopefully that gives you an idea of the sort of organisations that we're talking about. So in terms of what we did in the research, so we started with a literature review, and that's a really good overview of lots of different research into these organisations. So I'd really, I'm not going to touch on much of what's in the literature review in here, but I'd really recommend kind of going to look at that if you're interested in the kind of wider context. Obviously, this research is a kind of quite a sort of quantitative analysis of some data. There's obviously a lot more kind of richer information in lots of the research that's already been done on these organisations. So what we wanted to do was try and find below the radar organisations in data that's been published by funders about the grants they make. So while lots of funders will fund registered charities or other types of registered organisations, some of them do provide grants to organisations that haven't been registered as charities or in other forms. And what that means is it's often the only place where these organisations will sort of appear in kind of data. Otherwise, they're often kind of under the radar. And we do this by a process of kind of elimination. So what we do is, for lots of the grants that are published, we know that they are made to a charity. The funder might have provided the charity number, or we can match the name with a charity that we know about. So once we've removed all of those from our first data set, the ones that we're left, we can be fairly confident should tell us something about the below the radar sector. And that's once we've got those organizations, we can find out various things about them. I'll show you some keyword searching that we've done to try and find out what they're doing and what areas they're working in, for example. So the kind of overview of the results that we found 13,000 organizations that had grants between 2016 and 2019. This is obviously only the tip of the iceberg, and we wouldn't say that this is our number for the number of below the radar organizations, because this only represents those organizations that have received grants. So while we're kind of lowering the radar, there's obviously a whole swathe of other organizations, probably many more times that number, that haven't received grants. Usually, if you're getting a grant, it's for a specific project or a specific kind of purpose that your organization needs at that time. A lot of these organizations won't be needing or getting grants. And one other thing that we did was we also looked at some of the what we could term the registered grassroots sector. So these organizations that are technically on the radar, but only just. So, for example, lots and lots of smaller charities, we know that they're charities, we know they're on the register of charities, but actually the Charity Commission doesn't make much data about them available. They're not required for reasons of kind of reducing burden. They're not required to report very much. They don't necessarily have to submit their annual accounts, for example. So although we do know about them, we don't know much about them. So we wanted to look at that set of organisations as well. And we found about 22,000 of those organisations that received grants as well, and looked at them. Right. So now it's time for our quiz. So we're going to try and do play your below the radar cards right. So if you've not heard of play your cards right, essentially I'm going to give you a number, give you the next stat as well, and then you have to decide whether that next stat is going to be higher or lower than the one that I've just said. I don't think I've explained that very well, but hopefully we'll pick it up as we're going along. So I think, Kate, do we think it's best to use the emoji buttons in Zoom?
I did wonder, and then I forgot to mention that to Alice, and I'm recording on my screen. So Alice, I don't know if you can look at gallery view, and so when we go to this slide, we can ask people to do the thumbs up if they think it's higher, and not to click an emotion if they think it's lower. And then maybe you can let us know what the consensus looks like. Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so we'll try this. So we've done this a bit in person. It's obviously a bit different in Zoom. So we'll give it a go. We'll do the first one and then see whether we work it out. So, and these are all percentages. So these are usually like percentage of the organizations that we found or something. So here's our starting number. So we found that 14% of the grants to below the radar organizations went to arts and culture organizations working in arts and culture. And I think that was a bit higher than the grants that went to registered organizations. So arts and culture is quite kind of well represented in the below the radar organizations that we found. So this also requires my presentation to not spoil the answers as well. So the proportion of grants that went to organizations working in sport, do you think that was higher or lower than 14%? So do a thumbs up if you think it's higher.
3, 4. Oh, yes, well, definitely majority there.
Okay, so we think it might be higher. Maybe we do need an explicit. I can't see what the other emojis are, but maybe we could have a happy face or something for lower.
There is a surprised looking face.
Surprised looking face for, okay.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, that's what Vari stuck up. That thing that looks like I'm not sure the screen.
So it's lower. So only 5% of grants to below the radar organisations went to sport. Sport was one that came out in the what we called the registered grassroots. So there's a type of organisation called Community Amateur Sports Club. You have to register with HMRC. And that's one where we have a list of all of the sports clubs, but we have very little idea on how big they are or what they're doing or how many people are involved with them or that kind of thing. So we also looked at, as well as looking at the kind of theme, we looked at what we thought the grant was for, what the kind of activities that were done with the grants were. And one of the categories was grants that were for events, so putting on an event or a workshop or a sort of celebration or something like that. Do you think that was higher or lower than 5%? So thumbs up for higher, surprised face for lower. Got fairly big consensus on higher. It was higher. So 21% of the grants that we found were on events. And for the National Lottery Community Fund for Awards for All grants, which is their main kind of stream for that would pick up these kind of organizations, it was actually 50%. So a lot of what organizations are getting grants for at that kind of scale are for either one-off events or workshop series or something like that. So that was quite a, certainly for me, that was a kind of surprising finding. So I think this is the last one. So this is the proportion of grants, of all grants in London, that went to below the radar organisations. Do you think that's higher or lower than 21%? Kate thinks lower. A couple of highers, a few lowers, probably more lowers, I'd say. It was lower. So only 5% of grants in London went to below the radar organisations. That was the lowest of all the English regions that we looked at. That doesn't mean that there's not a thriving below the radar sector in London. That's probably a lot to do with the number of registered organisations that there are in London. Obviously, lots of national organisations are registered here, and that means that lots of lots of grants are going to those organisations. And there's a bit more regional data later on. So back to the research. I should have said at the start as well, if there are any questions or anything, then do let me know. I can't see the chat window at the moment, but hopefully someone will let me know if there's any kind of questions going along.
Will do.
So in terms of the research itself, we started with a base data set, which was taken from our 360 Giving data store. If you're interested in, this is a relatively new thing that we've developed recently, and it gives a bit more kind of granular data access, particularly for particularly if you're a developer or researcher who wants kind of really fine-grained access to the data, then let me know. We've got a page on the website about it if you want to access it. So we've got getting on for that should say grants, actually, not organizations in the first row. So when we did the research, we had around 350,000 grants. It's now over 400,000, particularly with lots of funders have started publishing during COVID. There's around 120 funders at the time. The biggest by quite some distance is the National Lottery Community Fund. We've got a lot of data going back a long time for that. And the biggest kind of by volume for them is definitely the Awards for All programme. And this research used so that data I've talked about goes back in some cases to the 90s. Most of it's over the last kind of 5 or 10 years. We restricted it to around 127,000 grants that covered 2016 to 2019. And as I say, we used the 360 Giving data store, which made it kind of really easy to access the whole data set. So in terms of our method, don't worry too much about this chart, but essentially what we're trying to show is, I talked about how we were doing it by a process of elimination. So we were removing all the organizations that we thought were registered. So we did that in a few different steps. The first one was some grants data includes what we call external identifiers, which essentially means it's got a charity number or a company's house number, something that helps us to verify kind of who that organization is. If they had one of those, we could take them out straight away because we knew we would find them on the Charity Commission register. For some organization, they didn't have an external identifier, but we tried to match them to an external record. So the most kind of simple of them was just literally matching the name against the name of that's on all the charity register, and that that meant that we could find another set of organizations that we thought were either registered charities or universities or various other kind of organizations that should have had an external identifier, but not all funders kind of published them. The next thing we did was we looked at trying to look at the type of organization. So if the organization was university of somewhere, then we could be fairly confident that that wasn't going to be a below the radar organization. there are a few other types where we thought that they probably were a below the radar organisation. So we had a whole list of kind of different keywords for finding different types of organisations. And then finally, there are a few kind of other criteria which are down in the very bottom of the chart that we use to take things out. So if they got a grant of over £10,000, that probably means that they're not below the radar. We probably should have found them some other way. If they got a grant that wasn't in pounds, it was in another currency, we took them out. And there are a few funders where we know they only fund registered organisations. So if they were coming up, we'd take those grants out as well. And that left us with these 12,800 grants. Just over half of those were grants from the National Lottery Community Fund. So that was a big part of our data set. And in some cases, we've kind of looked at those slightly separately because they do have different characteristics. So as I said, we found nearly 13,000 organisations. Just over half of them were from National Lottery. As I said earlier, we also found around 22,000 registered grassroots organisations, which is our term for those kind of smaller groups that are registered, but we don't know much about. And I thought it might be useful to show some of the, examples of the grants that were in our data. It sort of helps bring it to life a bit. So we've got funding for churches, for building projects, some kind of very small donations to help local groups, for veterans, looking after nature reserves, giving to local funds so they could kind of provide housing improvements. So a real kind of range of different activities in the data. So looking at the size of grants, as you'd expect, lots of them are receiving very small grants. If they were receiving big grants, then they probably should be registered. But 80% of those grants are under £5,000. For registered grassroots organisations, again, receiving very, very small grants compared to some of the grants that are in the data. And also we know that these are kind of small scale as well as small amounts. So only 4% of the grants that we found to below the radar organisations were for more than a year effectively. So the vast majority are either for capital projects, so they kind of spent effectively straight away, or for projects lasting a year or less. Excuse me. So there's a real kind of variety in the organisations that we found. We did find arts and culture particularly kind of coming up compared to other types of organisations, providing training and education, and then also kind of maintaining green spaces seemed to come up a lot. Registered grassroots, quite a lot of things to do with young people and with sport. So there were some categories that kind of came to the fore, but probably the variety is the kind of big message there, and the a real kind of range of different activities carried out by these organisations. So in terms of what's the activity that's funded by the grants, so as I said before, events was a big one, particularly for Awards for All and the National Lottery. For other funders, there was quite a lot of spending on refurbishing buildings or buying equipment, and I guess that makes sense in terms of the things that these types of organisations might need in terms of getting equipment to provide services or provide events. So that was definitely something that kind of stood out for the other funders. We, in terms of the kind of geographical perspective, we definitely found that regions outside London, the grant was more likely to go to a below the radar organisation. I think that definitely is down to a large registered sector in London, because there were still a large number of grants to the below the radar organisations in London. We also looked at grants by deprivation, where we were able to kind of match a grant to a postcode to then match it to the index of multiple deprivation for an area. If you're looking at the chart on the right there, the where it says 1, that's the most deprived areas by index of multiple deprivation, and 10 is the least deprived. Excuse me. So we definitely found that for the National Lottery, there was a clear skew towards the more deprived areas. And for other groups of organisations, it was less kind of clear. And for other funders funding these organisations, it was relatively kind of flat distribution, and not much variation, and kind of peaked in the middle. And I guess my sense of that was that that partly reflected the nature of these organisations. Not all of these organisations are dealing directly with the kind of effects of deprivation. Some of them are just providing kind of community activities that exist in lots of different communities, and providing that kind of bedrock for communities, no matter the sort of type of them. So that's a kind of very whistle-stop tour of the report. There's a link there to download the whole report. There was also, we did a blog post which has some links to download the data if you wanted to kind of look at the data itself and discover it a bit more. Yeah, I'm sure Kate can kind of provide those links to you as well. Cool. So is there any kind of burning questions or thoughts on the research itself? Before I go on, I'll then kind of give a demo of our insights tool.
Alice, are there any more? I answered. Bo asked about.
Sorry, I'm on mute.
Bo asked about local giving schemes, David, who are increasingly giving out small grants, very small grants to those below the radar organisations. So I did say that one option is for them to consider publishing that grant data, so it's within that 360 giving data set, and obviously let them know that 360 Giving can provide that support, because I did that with Love Kingston. So their grant should be included in that.
Definitely.
data.
And I think it's fair to say that at 360 Giving, we've been focused kind of initially very much on the largest funders to try and get that kind of big volume of grants across the country. So getting there was a big kind of celebration last week when we got the government to publish, because that's such a big chunk of money coming into the sector. But I think we really are keen that that across the kind of scale of grant making, that it's easy for anyone to publish, and it becomes much more of a kind of normal part of running a foundation, whatever size, to publish this data and kind of make it part of the sector's data resources.
There's a question from Vari in there. Vari, do you want to just ask it out loud?
Sure. Yeah, so first of all, really, really fascinating and incredibly useful, and all the work that 360 Giving is doing on all the bits of how we improve our kind of data is so useful to the sector. One thing I wanted to know is, is this something that you guys are going to kind of intend to kind of keep going on, that it's something that you'll be looking at updating yearly or biannually? And then a couple of things in relation to kind of how we might be able to kind of disaggregate some of the data. So in terms of London, might there be a way in future to separate out those that have an HQ in London versus those organisations that are actually delivering work in London? And also, and this is in relation to our work as a network that also supports kind of user-led non-constituted organisations. Is there a way of potentially over time seeing that journey from below the radar to just popping up on the radar to being a fully constituted organisation? And thirdly, just to give you one more, David, in terms of and we had a meeting with Bonnie, who's one of your colleagues, I think, in relation to how you might be delivering guidance on the type of data you collect on funders and beneficiaries of grants. Is there a way of looking at the user-ledness of an organisation? Because that, again, that's really, really important for our members and how those organisations actually impact on social change. Sorry, that's quite a lot in a very short sentence.
I'll try and remember that. So in terms of on the sort of ongoingness, there's not any specific plans to repeat it at the moment. As I said, I did it 5 years ago, and we've done it again. So maybe in 5 years' time. I guess the what we are doing is that part of what makes this research possible is improving the quality of the data. So we're definitely kind of working with funders to improve the quality, which hopefully makes it kind of easier to repeat on a kind of on an ongoing basis. And also we're working we're trying to make the data more useful and make it useful for whether it's academics or other researchers, so that it's kind of simple for other people to do this if there's interest in it, and particularly I mean, it would make sense for me that if there's particular themes that people are interested in, or areas, kind of geographic areas, then something that's kind of restricted to a particular area or a particular theme would be kind of relatively easy to do. In terms of disaggregating the kind of headquarters problem with London, that's definitely something that is semi-possible with some of the Charity Commission data, for example. So yeah, I think as the kind of data infrastructure for the sector improves, that kind of analysis should definitely be possible.
Sorry, so is it possible to see that kind of move? I mean, it's 2016 to 2019, but is it possible to see the journey from organisations being below the radar to becoming kind of more constituted?
Yeah, so that, and the other one you asked was about the user-led organisations. I think with both of those, it's not really possible at the moment, but I definitely feel like the getting the kind of data to a state where we can do that is definitely kind of the aim. With user-led organizations, I think there's we're limited to an extent in terms of what the grant makers are publishing about their grants. So some of it, like the work that you mentioned that Bonnie is doing, is about working with the funders to kind of improve that data, and a big part of that is making sure that the organizations have a stake in the data that's released about them, and that they feel like they can that it's a kind of fair representation of them. Yeah, I think in some ways adding a flag that says this is a user-led organization is the easy bit. The more tricky bit is making sure that data is kind of based in fact, and that the organizations kind of that are receiving the grants kind of go along with it. So yeah, those are definitely things that would be great to have in the data set. So I can quickly say in terms of trends in COVID-19, I think it would definitely be possible to kind of repeat the exercise with all the data that's been published since this was done. And the only problem with trends at the moment is that publishers can choose how much data they publish. So some of them have done 5 years, some of them have done the last year. So it can be tricky to kind of work out those trends, but hopefully as time goes on and the data is kind of more complete, then yeah, that will definitely bring out. So 360 Insights is one of the tools that we make available, and the idea behind this is it gives you an overview of a data set published in the 360 Giving standard. So we often talk about kind of 360 Giving data or the 360 Giving data set, but actually what it is funders publishing their own data, and then we do some things to combine it and put it all together. But really this is one of the ideas behind 360 Insights, is that you can look at the data published by the funders themselves, and kind of visualize that data. One of the other things it does is bring in other data. So, for example, where funders have put a postcode in the data or some kind of geographical information, we can bring that in and look up from that postcode. So we can put them in maps or work out what regions all the grants went to. Similarly, if they've included charity numbers, we can take data from the Charity Commission about those organisations and add that in. So we might have there be able to see what kind of size of organisations they've funded or what types of organisations. So to use 360 Insights, the easiest way is click on the Choose a Dataset button. You then get a list of all the funders that have published data and all the various files that they've published. I was looking at Hounslow, who have published data about so the Hounslow Council have published data about the grants that they make to voluntary and community sector organisations. Not every local authority has done it, unfortunately, but a few forward-thinking ones have done. You can see this has got 644 grants in it from between 2014 and last month. And if you click on that, it will then fetch the data. Sometimes it will take a longer time than that. If it's got to find the postcode data and bring it in, it can take a few minutes to do that, particularly if there's a larger number of grants. So you can see here we've got some summary information about the file, the number of grants, the number of different recipients in. So although there's 600 grants, there's only 300 recipients. So some organisations are getting more than one grant. The total amount, and then the kind of average size of the grant. And then we produce some kind of summary charts, essentially, that tell you something about the grant. So we can see here, this is mainly kind of smaller awards of up to £500. That's not a very helpful chart, is it? But this is basically showing you the different grant programs that the grants have been made under, when they were made, the different types of organisations that have been published. So most of them are registered charities, but there's quite a few which are in this identifier not recognised category. Lots of those may well be the below the radar organisations we've been talking about today. Obviously, given this is Hounslow, most of them are in London, where we've been able to match on the postcode. You also get this nice map where you can kind of zoom in and start finding out a bit more about some of the grants themselves. And then, yeah, this is where we're bringing in other data about the recipient organisations. So the age of the organisation based on when they registered, that's not in the original data, but we're able to add it in based on the Charity Commission. And the size of the organisation. So we can see that for the charities that are in the records, most of them are kind of at the smaller end of the scale, with a few big ones also receiving grants. And then at the end, we've got some tips for what you can do with the data next. So you can download the data yourself and play with it in Excel or your kind of tool of choice. We've got some suggestions of other tools and resources to help view the data. I really like Flourish. We do a kind of data surgery based on making some maps with Flourish, and then talk about booking an office hour if you're a funder with 360 Giving, or kind of feeding back to us. So that's 360 Insights. You can also then, if you're interested in, say, a particular year, you can restrict it to just the last few years, for example, or if you only wanted to see those ones that was to registered charity, you can kind of filter the data there. Or if there was a particular kind of grant program you're interested in, then you can kind of filter it down and get that information about the particular kind of subset that you're interested in. We've not got much time left, but I thought I'd just show you very quickly one of the ways you can combine. So GrantNav is our search engine for grants. So this takes all the 360 Giving data. You can then search for data in there. So you can search just the grants, or you can search for particular locations. So if I go for Hounslow again, because we're on that. So this is found nearly 1,000 grants in Hounslow. Obviously some of these are coming through from the same data set. There's also grants from National Lottery or Sport England in here. And once you've got, once you're happy with your results, you can then, there's a button to download as CSV in the top right. You can do that, and then you can actually upload that to 360 Insights here, and then select the data there, and that will allow you to look at that search from GrantNav in 360 Insights. Yeah, sorry, there's not much time left, so that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of 360 Insights, but do have a look at it. Feel free to get in touch. We'd love to know how people are using it. We're having a bit of a refresh of GrantNav and of 360 Insights at the moment, so if you've got things that you'd like it to do that it doesn't do, either of the tools, then do let us know, and we can feed that into the work we're doing to upgrade it.
You can be quite sophisticated in your filtering on GrantNav, can't you? So you've shown a borough, but you could, I've used it before. I've looked for keywords in the title and description of an organisation, for example, when I was looking at all of the funded organisations that support refugees and migrants, for example. Yeah. So there's quite a lot that you can do with the search and the kind of advanced search in GrantNav, and then what's great is you can download that and add it into 360 Insights, and the visualization and charts are all done for you. You can slice and dice once you're there, can't you, as well? Right. So yeah.